Well, I'm honored to be here in this unique format. And well, I'll start. I'll cut to the quick here. I think a lot of you, or some of you at least, know that I wrote a book. And it's just come out. It's called The Four Desires. And I thought I'd just kind of paint a little bit of a picture, perhaps, about what motivated me to write it and maybe what it's all about. First of all, I'll say this. The book was written for a large audience. It wasn't written just for people who practice yoga. And because I do think it tackles and looks at some very fundamental ideas around how to have a fulfilled life, you know. And so, but nonetheless, it is based on yoga tradition and yoga knowledge, and particularly the traditions of tantra and Veda. You know, it's an interesting thing. One of the most revered and probably important texts on the living of life from a yoga perspective, the Bhagavad Gita, begins with a question. And it's worth just looking at that, and it's, I think, pivotal that we do. Because it's a question that we all ask ourselves so many times, with such frequency, it's hard to even really fathom that how much influence that single question has in our life. And the question's a simple one. The question is, what's next? What's next? What is the next moment? What's my next choice? One of the presumptions, the basic assumptions that the Vedas are founded on is that every moment is a choice. That each moment we are in action, we're thinking. Every thought has a seed as a desire. There's a desire behind every thought. There's a desire behind every action. I'm trying to change my position a little bit. To do that, I'd had to have the desire to do it. To reach for water, I have to have the desire to reach for water. So if you think about how many actions you do, in fact, as you're sitting in the room, you guys are making a choice about how you're sitting right now. Perhaps you're making a choice about what you're thinking about. And I guess the question, and part of what my motivation was around it was, when all is said and done, we do yoga, and everyone here is a big fan. What's next? What after I do yoga? You know, really, if you practice for 30 minutes a day, or 20 minutes once a week, or 3 hours a day, or 5 hours a day, or goodness knows how much you practice, we're always still left with that question. How will I treat the people around me? How will I treat myself? Who do I want to become? What deep in my heart needs to be expressed? How do I deal with disappointment? Every moment is a what's next. And I found it intriguing. You know, early in my yoga career, I had a big disappointment. I was blessed to have an extraordinary teacher, really an extraordinary teacher, a great being, great soul, so knowledgeable, full of power. But when I met him, he was about 72. He lived to 93. And he, to me, embodied as robust an embrace of life as I had ever encountered in my whole life. And he guided me into some amazing methodologies. I was in my early 20s at the time, and I had pretty quickly, after about a year of studying with him, already kind of developed a 3-hour to 3.5 hour a day practice. Meditated for an hour in most sublime methodologies, and by then, you know, getting my leg behind my head was starting to happen, and my feet were popping up on my head in pretty advanced postures, and all sorts of really kind of cool, calendar-like stuff, you know? And then the realization came, as I was living my life, I'd go back to that little room I had where I did my regular practice, and the realization came that there was never going to be a pose that was going to solve everything. That a lot of my inner questions and even disappointments I was experiencing in relationships and challenges in life, how was I going to make a living, how was I going to amount to anything, you know? Those questions were always calmed. The anxiety around not having answers to those questions was calmed when I did yoga, but I wasn't finding the answers. And I realized there was no pose that was going to have this magical effect of removing all of those questions and resolving them. Like how to, you know, there's a great saint, Meyer Baba, once said that we have to learn how to love. We actually don't come into the world knowing how to love. And many of us, I think, our experience is disappointment and doing it wrongly and picking the wrong people teaches us more about the right way to love. The point is that Trikonasana is not going to teach you how to love and be in the vulnerability and the intimacy and the exchange of relationship. There's a word in the Vedic tradition that gets really little press in the modern day yoga world, and that all human beings should be using, which is the word is vichara. And there's another one called vitarka. Vitarka means to reason, and vichara means to reflect. It's like to actually take the time to look in and to ask those big questions. Like and maybe the most important one is, what are the parts of myself that are worth keeping? What are the parts of myself not worth keeping? And I wish I could tell you that, I started this story by saying it was a disappointment to figure out that there wasn't a pose that was going to magically resolve that stuff. I see yoga practitioners wrestling with those same questions. I see non-yoga practitioners wrestling with the question of, who am I meant to be? You know, it's unique in the yoga kind of experience because the experience you have after yoga, it's so enriching. You feel so enriched, uplifted and inspired. But my reason for writing this book had everything to do with yoga, wanting yoga to be something more than a way to treat the symptoms of our restlessness and dissatisfaction. I wanted to address the idea, rather than yoga being a practice to deal with the symptoms of not being fully happy, to use the yoga methodology and philosophy of how we actually address being more happy. And again, taking from that Bhagavad Gita, the beginning, the thing I brought up in the beginning, the answer to that question is really straightforward. It's very simple. You've got to fulfill your purpose. It's an inspiring text in the sense that it says that each of us is unique. Each of us has a unique role to play. I think something I say in the book, each of us has a unique luster to add to the gem of this world. And to the extent that you and I are fulfilling that, we can be happy. And really my own personal experience is, it doesn't matter what poses you can do or can't do. It doesn't matter how much money is in the bank. It doesn't matter whether or not you have your dream lover. It doesn't matter how much, fill in the blank. If you're not doing that, if you haven't found and begun to live for and commit and ultimately catch the fire of that purpose, no amount of anything will actually satisfy you. And we live at a time of so much distress, you know, so much unhappiness, that to me, one of the main reasons, it's not because everyone's not doing yoga. Yoga will help. But it's that we've lost our way. This effective teaching, this essential teaching, is kind of part of our vocabulary of living. So I make the case that that process of vichara, of asking and reflecting about who am I here to be? You know, what am I intended to be? And the tradition actually kind of goes a little bit further, and that's the basis for the book. It says that you have 4 desires, that you are actually born with 4 desires, and the one I've just described is the one that's preeminent. To fulfill your unique purpose, and by the way, there's often a confusion about that. People think like, well, my purpose is my profession. I haven't figured out my profession. Am I going to be a yoga teacher or an attorney? Usually it's not that question, but it's something like that. Profession's not the same as purpose. Yeah, that's part of it. But here's what I would tell you, that once you find your purpose, it shines through all aspects of your life, not just your profession. It shines through your relationships. It shines through your profession. It shines through your love of creativity and how you show up for the world as a whole in every aspect of your life. So the tradition says the preeminent desire is dharma, to become who you were meant to be. The next one is to have the means to do that, so that's money. I'm now starting to step into really kind of maybe tricky terrain for people who've studied different Eastern contemplative traditions. The whole idea of where does desire come in? Is money okay? Is money an antithesis to being spiritually fulfilled? If I'm actually making money, I'm getting less spiritual. There's actually thinking along that. And you know, this is really particular to the crowd I'm talking to. Although this group, of course, is more enlightened. But if you talk to most normal human beings who've never dabbled in any of this stuff called yoga or philosophy or meditation, and you say, hey, you know, let me tell you something profound. You've got desires. Some are going to help you, and some are not going to help you. And they'll go, yeah? But when I come to a yoga world, into the yoga world, and I say, you know, you have some desires, and some come from your soul. And they go, wait a minute. I don't buy it. Some are helpful, and some are not helpful. What Buddha and others have preached is our relationship to those desires. So the second desire is for money. Most importantly, what that is, it's the means to fulfill your purpose. So, you know, a laptop is part of my means to fulfill my purpose and teach and write. So is my smartphone. That's part of my means. Clearly, my physical health and well-being is part of my means. I want that. You have a natural urge to be healthy. That's a good thing, right? That's not a bad thing. Would we agree? Mm-hmm. And then you just need the tools to actually execute and express your purpose. The third desire, this is where it gets sometimes tricky, is for pleasure. And that means beauty and art and intimacy and sensuality and sexuality and fellowship and kindness and warmth. Now, can we get lost in that? Absolutely. But your soul also longs for expression. Otherwise, was like Da Vinci kind of just not a spiritual guy because he was doing stuff like that. Michelangelo, we want to write him off. And Mozart, let's bag him. Because is really the love of beauty actually contributes to this world. And it's part of their purpose. And the final one, of course, that yogis can kind of together relate to is this idea of liberation, moksha, freedom. And that one we have a tendency to kind of really focus on, whereas the tantric tradition and lately a more enlightened kind of vision of this has come forward, and that is, you know, it's one of four desires. The desire to have freedom, desire to live your life and to not have burdens. And you know, a lot of people, when they wake up in the morning, the alarm goes off, and the first thought is, oh, damn. A whole nother day of commitment, of having to do things that I don't love to do, of having to show up in ways I don't love showing up. I wish it were different. That desire is the desire for moksha. That's the desire for freedom. It's also probably the desire that your actions that day will have meaning and purpose in your life. That's dharma. And it's probably sooner or later you're going to want that cup of coffee, or you're going to want a warm shower, or you're going to want something delightful. That's part of human nature. And the final one, of course, is all along you're going to want the means to execute those things. So I guess in wrapping this up, I've just, part of the book, and the book is mostly interactive, but the beginning has to be a little bit of a didactic about what is desire. And in the tradition they say there's satyakama, asatyakama, and it's very simple. It means there's truthful desires, desires that are righteous and supportive, desires that are helpful, desires that are your soul's language, and desires that are asatyakama, which are desires that are not helpful. So our job, and what this book walks you through, is this, the whole kind of methodology around getting clear about your purpose, and from that all the desires, that to the extent that you play with them and you make the conscious effort to fulfill them, you're actually not only providing, supporting your own well-being, you're ultimately supporting the well-being of everybody. If you're thriving, you're helping us thrive. So that's kind of this whole system and kind of the thought process involved in it, in a glimpse. I heard, do we have some time for questions?
Questions, yeah. This is actually kind of you seem so well-versed and so well-educated. And other than your book, I'm curious, what 3 books would you recommend reading?
But I'm not clear on the nature of what you're interested in.
If you were to say, these are 3 really wonderful books, as a teacher, I think you should read these things. This was helpful to me.
Today, this is the answer to that question. First one was I'd read At the 11th Hour by Pandit Rajmani Tuganayat. At the 11th Hour gives you a scope of the tradition, of the yoga tradition, the Vedic tradition, tantric tradition, and it's written as a biography of his teacher and his teacher's life. The second book, wow. I know what the third is, so I'm kind of saving the best for last. I would just read the collected writings of Hafiz or something. I would just read someone who had really, truly tasted it and expressed it in a worldly way. And what we're talking about, it being sublime, something that really, their heart was full and they expressed it exquisitely. And the last one I'd say is read the Brothers Karamazov. And in that book is, clearly one of the greatest writers of all time, Dostoevsky. But in that book, you see you see how choice, and really, and this is something we all need to recognize, is that you and I are really and this is where I started today, is that we are the accumulation of the choices we've made in the past. There really should be no surprises. If we go, how did I wind up here? Just figure out the choices you made. It's not complicated. It's a very logical progression. Add up the choices, here you are. It's not random. So the Brothers Karamazov is dark and light and funny and sad and touching, and I haven't read it in 20 years, but it's still with me.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You talk about reflection. Is that for you something that just underlies everything you do and you're just kind of open to seeing your opportunity as it arises, or is it something that you're actually digging in for and looking for something to come up? So is it spontaneous, or are you actually sitting there and being like, what is my purpose? Let me go into this.
Yeah, it's a great question. That's a great question. Both. It's both. There's a very fine line about living your life and not being judgmental, but on the other hand, living your life and constantly asking questions, looking to the extent to which you see truth living in other people, and learning from them, and what do their actions, what's the effect of their actions, and looking at the world. And I wouldn't call myself a news junkie, but I'm conscious of current events, and I think that's really important. I do. So I'm always reflecting, really, truly. But what I was intending to convey was that we need to take a little time. We need to take the time and set about in a deliberate way, a deliberate process of self-reflection. And unfortunately, the yoga tradition hasn't laid that out for us. Again, like many of these teachings, they're meant to be shared from a teacher. But there are systematic approaches to this idea of reflection. It's one version of that I've done in the Four Desires. So I think we need to do both.
Hi, just curious what your personal practice looks like on an everyday basis.
It's not too complicated. I can share that with you. I practice every day. I practice pretty close to rising. I've got a very full house. There's 4 kids and a wife, and thankfully, the wife is there. And so as quickly as I can. The real thing I need to do is get up before everybody else, and I will, depending on the time of year, take a shower or not first. It's in Colorado. I live in Colorado, so in the winter it's sometimes actually not helpful. You actually get cold because you're wet. Yes or no on the shower, and then I will go practice. And the practice consists probably on average of about 45 minutes of asana, but that's a very it's a very energetic-oriented practice. I don't mean moving a lot. I mean there's bandhas and mudras and breath retentions in my physical practice. And I'm assuming we won't start talking about what those are. I'm assuming yogis know what they are. So those are just ways to really make the practice more energetically robust. And then short shavasana. I sit up, do some breathing methodology, breathing technique, and meditate anywhere from a short day is about half an hour, and upwards of closer to an hour. That's what my practice looks like. Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously, you've taken the Purusharthas, the four goals of life from the Vedic tradition, and you've given them a tantric spin. I assume that was your thought process. What in giving them a tantric spin were you thinking about in applying them to the modern circumstance? Like, how are you trying to frame it? I mean, obviously, you're trying to update the understanding of this kind of ancient set of goals. But you have your own tantric tradition, which is not Vedic. What were you thinking in terms of, like, what was the course of ahas, I guess, that brought you to figuring out how you could apply this to modern living? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So Eric's question is relevant because Eric knows me well enough that in my other life, this book is quite distinct from the way I teach and what I teach. And what I teach is very technical and science-based ancient tradition knowledge. And given to me by my teachers, time-tested for thousands of years. No, I consider, if I have a brand and it's a new kind of version of yoga, it's because it's an old version of yoga. Yeah. And that's what makes it unique. The truth was that I was compelled to get this idea out about living a full life to people who practice yoga and don't practice yoga. And I stepped away from that mindset, that whole idea of teaching methodology directly related to tantric science. I didn't want it to become a kind of more narrow view of tantra. The idea really, honestly, growing up when I was a young boy, I think one of my first gurus was a book, Leonardo da Vinci. And there was this book that was, it was sitting on the shelf. It weighed, it weighs like 40 pounds, this book. I now have another version of it, but have you ever seen Da Vinci's collected works? It's a book like this big. And I was so compelled to see the vastness of this man's, his scope, his imagination, his creativity, his vegetarianism. I mean, the scope of this man's life was so profound, and something inculcated in my consciousness the idea of the living of a full life. And it really doesn't matter what the method is, as long as you have some way of living a full life. And when I interfaced with the tantric tradition and the science, it opened my eyes because suddenly there was a worldview and methods to help create that. But then what I decided to do is really create an opportunity for people to use methodologies inspired from that worldview of how do we experience fullness at every level: material, spiritual, mental, and emotional, professional. Whether I use specifically something very scientific related to tantra or not, I didn't feel confined by that. When I stand and I'm teaching ParaYoga, I feel more, that's what I have to teach. But so the book was a little bit of a departure, but at the same time, like me, sitting in that room doing yoga for 3 hours in my early mid-20s, and still feeling like the yoga wasn't addressing everything. I needed to do reflection. I needed to look inward. I needed to ask questions. That's what I wanted to facilitate. So, stick around. The next book will be here, and that'll be the technical stuff. Mm-hmm. This is the spirit of living fully and how we come to terms with that. What stands in the way and how we fully express it. Thanks.
You mentioned several times your teaching, you mentioned scientifically proven. I just wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I had a scientist in a classroom just recently, and she's like, "Why are you using the word science?" So maybe I'm taking some liberty, but let me explain the liberty I'm taking. And this is part of the gift of knowing this art or science called yoga. If we all now sat up and laid down even and decided we'd all commit to, let's say, exhaling 2 times slower than we were inhaling. That's a mechanical process, right? Inhaling, exhaling. And the exhale's twice as long. Takes 2 times longer to breathe out. There would be there would be a universal effect. We'd all be calmer. If we did the opposite, where the inhale became longer and the inhale slower than it took me twice as long to inhale, we'd actually have the opposite effect. It would stimulate the sympathetic nervous system and I'd become activated. Now here's my basis for calling that science. That happens whether you believe in it or not. That happens whether you're Jewish or Christian or Muslim, whether you're a cab driver or you're a CEO. It's independent of time, place, culture, faith. And there's quite a few things. I mean, we can extend that now to forward bends and backward bends. Forward bends will calm me down. If I stretch the back of my body, stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, I relax. If I do back bends and my kidneys get compressed, it stimulates my sympathetic nervous system, and I get activated. Time, place, that's the beauty of yoga today in the West, is that so many people from so much diversity has come to this because the answer is it works. Simple, it works. And that's why I say science. And the more you're willing to explore the less material aspects of the science, you got to be willing, because there's some esoteric parts of this that's become a little hard to believe or seem too fantastic. So if you want to have a good day, for instance, a tantric tradition, a tantric science or methodology is the moment you wake up, this is going to sound very airy-fairy, but whatever. Here you go, YouTube. It's going to rot in airy-fairy. The moment you wake up, establish which nostril is dominant. At any given time, one will more than likely be predominant. You'll find more breath flow through one nostril than the other. Then make the point of your first step out of bed being the same foot. Try it. Now that sounds, okay, I bought the forward bed backward thing or the breath thing, but this sounds a little, but the yogis, and if you don't, again, we're going to make another plug for Tantra. The Tantric tradition, the extent and reach of the science is so profound. I mean, I don't have all that time to tell you about it, but I mean, my teacher created, like in most parts of the United States, there's this die-off of bees, honeybees. And that's a huge deal. They're a key part of the ecological system. Bees and frogs are it. And so he, again, this is going to sound out there, he did a ceremony around it, which he used particular herbs and mantras. 9 months later, all the bees are back. Now, the strange thing is, they're only back in a 20-mile radius of the yoga studio, of this spot in Pennsylvania. They're not anywhere else. I don't know. I'm going to call that science. Again, it seems less scientific, but if it could be repeated time and time again, which it has been, that knowledge has been passed down for literally thousands of years. So that's why we're a little loose. We're playing a little loose with the term, but that's where I'm coming from. Yeah.
I had an opportunity to take the yoga fulfillment course 5 years ago, and it's an amazing course. I highly recommend anybody to take it. It's an amazing course, and the teachings that were transmitted and that some of them I didn't even understand 5 years ago are really still very much present. And what helped me through that process was having the community of people through that course. And so my question for you is, within the book and the ParaYoga community is sort of what are the plans to create community around the book for the people that are going to start to go through this process and really, and who are they going to talk to and ask questions to and bring those things to?
That's a great question. We're really at the early stage. The truth is I've spent so much time in the book for so long that besides the book, my family, and teaching, there was basically sleeping. So here we are. The truth that's really compelling and interesting to me, Jessica, is what in your question is this, is that there's a natural inclination to share that process with people. What I've noticed time and time again, and I make that recommendation to people, is you bring buddies into the process to help lead you through, because it's not always easy to see ourselves, and we want to move through it. We want, despite our desire to move through it, sometimes there's challenges about it. To become who we really want to be, sometimes we have to move through some layers. So the group dynamic is really powerful, which is sharing the groups. I know book clubs are already forming. And now they're beginning to take shape on the internet. And we, in the next month or so, rodstryker.com, there'll be more and more information relative to that. Next year, we're going to start an e-seminar process. And then I'm actually doing a training around it to train people to facilitate the process. And they will be available as coaches, and they'll be available to kind of follow up in seminars as well. So I'm glad you bring it up. It's definitely a very live part. It's really now where I turn my focus, which is to facilitate the book taking hold in people's lives. And you know, the book really gets fun when you're halfway through it. The first half, although I think it's interesting, that's where some really key work is. That if you stop, if you feel overly challenged there, you're really missing the process. You've got to go through the whole thing. So groups will definitely help, and that's kind of where we're building e-seminars and book club, and there's little community things happening all the time, but as I said, it'll be more and more a presence, and that'll be on rodstryker.com, and something at Elephant Journal. Our friend at Elephant Journals are giving us some love, so we'll find that. People will be able to find that presence and support really soon. Well, thank you to everyone, and thank you to Wanderlust.